On a cold morning in 1994, Chicago looked normal. Cars moved, people walked, offices opened. By the end of that winter, hundreds of people would be dead, and most of them never realized they were in danger. In the morning 1994, Chicago looked exactly the way it was supposed to. The sky was clear, the light was pale but steady. Snow rested quietly along sidewalks and curbs, packed down from days before. Cars started one by one, coughing briefly before settling into a familiar hum. People stepped outside, collars turned up, hands buried in pockets, breath visible for a moment before disappearing into the air. Nothing felt wrong. Alarms rang in small apartments and brick walk-ups. Coffee brewed. Radios murmured softly in kitchens. Parents reminded children to wear gloves. Office workers checked the time and moved a little faster, knowing winter always made mornings slower. This was Chicago. Cold was not unusual. Cold was expected. It was part of the rhythm of life. People dressed for it. Heavy coats, wool hats, scarves pulled tight, boots that had seen many winters before. Some wrapped scarves twice around their necks, others trusted layers and experience. The cold stung, but it was familiar, the kind you complained about while walking, the kind that made you think about spring, not danger. Buses arrived late but arrived, trains ran, shops opened. The city did what it always did. At bus stops, people shifted their weight from one foot to the other, stamping lightly to keep warm. Conversations were short. No one lingered longer than necessary, but no one panicked either. The cold felt sharp, yes, but manageable. People had work to get to, bills to pay, schedules that didn't pause for weather. This is how deadly winters begin, not with fear, with routine. Downtown, office buildings filled slowly. Elevators hummed. Heaters worked harder than usual, but they worked. In residential neighborhoods, elderly residents looked out through frosted windows, deciding whether today was a good day to go out or a good day to stay in. Many chose to stay home, planning to wait for temperatures to rise. It felt sensible. It felt safe. Outside, the wind cut deeper than expected. It slipped between buildings, down long streets, around corners where sunlight never quite reached. Wind chill pulled warmth from exposed skin faster than people realized. Fingers went numb quickly, faces tightened. People pulled scarves higher and kept walking. No one wanted to stop. Cold like this doesn't feel dramatic. It feels inconvenient. A man walked 3 blocks instead of waiting longer for a bus. A woman decided to walk home from work instead of standing in the wind. Someone sat in a car with the engine running, heater on low, thinking they'd warm up before driving again. Someone else stayed in an apartment with poor heating, wrapped in blankets, telling themselves they'd check on things later. These decisions felt small, logical, ordinary. That's what made them dangerous. The temperature continued to drop, but slowly. Slow enough that it didn't trigger alarms in people's minds. Chicago had seen colder days before. Winter always had a few brutal mornings. The difference was not obvious yet. It hid inside the wind, inside the hours, inside how long people were exposed without realizing it. By late morning, sidewalks were quieter, not empty, just thinner. People moved with purpose, shoulders hunched, heads down. The city still functioned, but it moved differently, like a body conserving energy. Stores stayed open. Offices stayed lit. Life continued in neat, familiar lines, and that was the illusion. Because while the city looked normal, the cold was doing something invisible. It was draining strength faster than bodies could replace it. It was turning waiting into risk, stillness into danger, isolation into something far more serious than loneliness. Some people felt it first as fatigue, others as confusion. Some didn't feel it at all, until they stopped moving. No sirens marked the moment winter crossed from uncomfortable to lethal. No announcement warned people that today was different. The cold didn't arrive like a disaster. It blended into the day so well that no one noticed when the margin for safety disappeared. By the end of that day, some people would not make it home. Not because they ignored warnings, not because they chased danger, but because they trusted routine. This is the part of the story that matters most. Not the numbers, not the aftermath. The beginning, a normal winter morning, a city doing what it always does, and a cold that quietly stayed longer than expected. What made this winter in Chicago so dangerous was not how it looked, but how ordinary it felt. There was no wall of snow swallowing the skyline, no whiteout erasing streets, no dramatic moment that told people to stop what they were doing. The sky stayed clear. The sun appeared on schedule. Snow from earlier days lay quietly, already part of the scenery. To most people, it felt like a real Chicago winter day. Cold, sharp, uncomfortable, but familiar enough to ignore. And familiarity is exactly what lowers caution. Chicagoans were used to cold numbers on thermometers. They had lived through harsh winters before, so temperature alone didn't register as a warning. What many didn't feel immediately was the wind, slicing through coats and seams, stripping heat away minute by minute, turning exposed skin numb faster than the body could respond. Wind chill doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like danger. It feels like irritation, the kind you push through because standing still feels worse than moving on. The city's rhythm reinforced that feeling. Buses still ran, even if they were late. Trains still arrived, even if platforms felt unbearable. Offices remained open. Stores kept their lights on. When systems continue to function, the mind assumes safety. People trust continuity. If work is open, if traffic moves, if neighbors are outside, then the situation can't be serious. That's the quiet logic most people follow. Even public messaging didn't sound urgent. Cold warnings blend into winter noise, especially in a place where winter is expected. There was no reason on the surface to cancel plans, skip work, or treat the day as different from dozens of other cold mornings people had already survived. What made this cold deceptive was how slowly it took away margin. The body loses heat steadily in extreme wind, even when fully clothed. Standing still for 10 minutes becomes risky. Walking a few extra blocks becomes exhausting. Small decisions, wait or walk, stop or keep going, rest or push through, begin to matter more than people realize. Cold narrows options quietly. It doesn't force dramatic choices, it encourages practical ones. People walked to save time. People stayed seated to conserve energy. People delayed asking for help because nothing felt urgent yet. Inside buildings, the danger was even harder to see. Older apartments struggled to hold warmth, but heaters didn't fail loudly. They worked just enough to feel tolerable at first. Rooms felt cool, not freezing. People layered clothing indoors, wrapped up in blankets, told themselves they'd check on the heat later. Cold indoors doesn't shock the senses the way cold outside does. It creeps in, dulling alertness, slowing movement, making rest feel reasonable. That's when winter becomes most effective. When it convinces people to stop moving. The city itself helped hide the threat. Downtown streets were busy enough to look normal, but quiet enough to miss what was happening at the edges. In residential neighborhoods, sidewalks emptied earlier than usual. People shortened trips. Errands were postponed. The cold thinned the city without stopping it, and that thinning mattered. Fewer eyes, fewer casual check-ins, fewer chances for someone to notice that a bus stop had been occupied too long, that a car hadn't moved, that a light stayed on all day behind a frozen window. This is the pattern that repeats in deadly winters. The cold that kills is not the one people fear, but the one they recognize. It borrows the shape of every winter before it and asks nothing new of people except patience. And patience in extreme cold is not neutral. Time becomes the hidden variable. Every extra minute outside, every extra hour in a cooling room quietly shifts the balance. By the time cold feels alarming, it has often already done its work. That is why this winter didn't stop the city. It slipped into it. It let routines continue just long enough for ordinary decisions to turn dangerous. And when the consequences finally appeared, They didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced later, quietly, in places where no one had been looking, in still streets, in silent apartments, in the spaces between a normal morning and a home that was never reached. By the time the danger became real, it didn't announce itself with panic or noise. It revealed itself through ordinary decisions that suddenly carried weight. In Chicago, people kept doing what made sense on any other winter day, unaware that the margin for safety was shrinking by the hour. A bus that was 10 minutes late felt annoying, not threatening. Waiting seemed reasonable. Walking a few extra blocks felt practical. Sitting in a car to warm up felt smart. Staying home in a cool apartment felt safer than going back outside. None of these choices were reckless. Each one was logical, familiar, and made without urgency. That is exactly why the cold worked so well. At bus stops, people stood still longer than their bodies could tolerate. Wind wrapped around shelters and slipped through cracks, pulling heat away faster than anyone noticed. Fingers went numb, then stiff. Faces lost sensation. Time stretched. When buses finally arrived, some people were already too cold to recover quickly. Others never boarded at all, choosing instead to walk, believing movement would keep them warm, not realizing that extreme cold drains energy faster than it creates it. Walking became labored. Breathing felt heavier. Muscles tightened. What should have been a short trip turned into exhaustion. Inside cars, the story was just as quiet. Vehicles that failed to start left people stranded longer than expected. Engines that ran provided temporary relief, but fuel ran low. Some people stayed seated too long, waiting to warm up before driving again. Cold inside a car doesn't feel immediately deadly. It feels uncomfortable, then tiring, then strangely calm. Fatigue sets in. Thinking slows, decisions are delayed. The cold doesn't force action, it encourages waiting. In apartments and houses, especially older buildings, heating systems struggled unevenly. Some rooms stayed tolerable while others cooled steadily. People layered clothing, wrapped themselves in blankets, and stayed in one place to conserve warmth. It felt sensible. Movement uses energy, rest saves it, but extreme cold punishes stillness. Body temperature drops gradually. Alertness fades. What begins as rest becomes risk, especially for those living alone, with no one to notice the change. The city itself made this worse by continuing to function just enough to hide the problem. Streets were open. Businesses remained active. Lights stayed on in offices and stores. From the outside, nothing looked urgent. But between buildings, under overpasses, and along quieter streets, exposure accumulated. Cold turned short delays into long ones. It stretched minutes into hazards. It narrowed choices until people were simply trying to get through the next moment. This is where winter becomes most dangerous, not at its peak, but during its persistence. The body can endure cold briefly. What it struggles with is duration. The longer exposure continues, the less margin remains for recovery. Warmth doesn't return instantly once someone gets indoors. Circulation slows, dexterity fades. Simple tasks, unlocking a door, climbing stairs, dialing a number, become harder. And when those tasks fail, the consequences follow quickly. What makes this part of the story so unsettling is how invisible it was. There were no dramatic scenes to draw attention, no crowds gathering, no alarms sounding. People were scattered, one at a bus stop, one in a car, one in an apartment, one walking home, each experiencing the cold alone. Isolation amplified everything. Without witnesses, without interruption, cold had time to work. By the end of the day, routines had thinned into risks. Ordinary places, sidewalks, stairwells, parked cars became endpoints instead of transitions. Not because people ignored danger, but because danger looked exactly like every winter day they had survived before. This is the moment when a winter crosses its quiet line. Not when the temperature drops, but when normal decisions stop being safe. The true weight of that winter did not reveal itself during the coldest hours of the day. It appeared later, slowly, quietly when people began to notice absences. In Chicago, there was no single moment when the city realized something terrible had happened. There was no siren that marked the turning point. Instead, there were small, unsettling gaps in routine. Someone didn't show up for work. A phone rang unanswered. A neighbor's door stayed closed longer than usual. Winter didn't announce its damage. It waited to be discovered. Emergency workers encountered scenes that looked ordinary at first glance. A person sitting at a bus stop slumped slightly forward, as if resting. Someone in a parked car, head tilted, appearing asleep. A figure in a stairwell, coat still on, keys nearby. These were not dramatic locations. They were the places people passed through every day. And that was the most unsettling part. The cold had not dragged anyone somewhere dangerous. It had met them in the middle of normal life. Inside apartments, the discoveries were even quieter. Many of the victims had done what felt sensible, stayed indoors, layered clothing, waited for the cold to pass. Heaters that worked inconsistently gave a false sense of security. Rooms cooled gradually, bodies adapted until they couldn't. Some people were found in beds, blankets pulled tight. Others in chairs, lights still on. There were no signs of panic, no evidence of struggle. Just stillness. The cold had not rushed them. It had waited. What struck responders and neighbors alike was how close safety had been. In some cases, warmth was only a few steps away. A working heater in another room, a neighbor across the hall, a building entrance that had been passed moments earlier, but extreme cold narrows awareness. It slows reaction. It makes reaching out feel unnecessary until it's too late. Winter doesn't need distance to be deadly. It only needs time. As the days passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. Most of those who died were alone when it happened. Isolation was the final factor. Elderly residents living by themselves, low-income workers in poorly heated buildings, people without cars, without reliable transportation, without someone checking in daily. The city had not failed them loudly. It had simply not reached them in time. What makes this part of the story difficult is how unremarkable it looked from the outside. Streets were still plowed. Businesses reopened as temperatures eased. Life resumed its shape. And yet, behind doors and in quiet corners, winter had already taken its toll. The deaths didn't cluster in one dramatic place. They were scattered like punctuation marks across the city, easy to miss unless you were looking closely. There were no headlines that matched the scale of what happened. Numbers were discussed later, but numbers don't capture absence. They don't explain the empty seat at work, the unanswered knock, the routine that never resumed. Winter had not stormed through Chicago. It had passed through it gently, leaving gaps that only became visible after the cold loosened its grip. This is the moment when a winter earns its place in history, not because of how it looks, but because of what it quietly removes. Not chaos, not destruction. People, one by one, in ordinary places, on ordinary days. By the time the city fully understood what had happened, the cold had already moved on. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all. Winter doesn't stay to explain itself. What makes this winter so unsettling is not only what happened, but what didn't stop happening. In Chicago, life continued, almost normally. Offices reopened as soon as roads cleared. Trains resumed their schedules. Traffic returned to its steady flow. From the outside, the city looked resilient, even efficient, and in many ways it was. That resilience, however, became part of the problem. When a city keeps moving, it sends a powerful signal to everyone inside it. Things are under control. People take their cues from motion. If the city moves, they move with it. If lights are on and doors are open, it feels safe to step back into routine. But winter doesn't need to shut a city down to be deadly. It only needs to thin it. In the days after the coldest stretch, sidewalks filled again, but not the way they had before. The change was subtle. Fewer people at bus stops, fewer early morning walkers, quieter stairwells in older apartment buildings. Absences blended into the background of a large city. In a place with millions of people, a missing person doesn't immediately stand out. Urban life absorbs loss quietly. The city doesn't pause long enough to notice what's missing. This is one of the hardest truths about modern winter disasters. When systems continue to function, danger becomes invisible. Power stayed on in most places. Emergency services responded, but not all at once, not everywhere. There was no single moment when the city's attention focused fully on the cold. Instead, responsibility was spread thin across departments, neighborhoods, and households. Everyone assumed someone else was handling it. And winter works best in those gaps. For many people, returning to routine felt comforting. Getting back to work felt like relief. Normalcy suggested survival. But for others, that return marked the end of a fragile window, the moment when checks stopped, when concern faded, when isolation deepened. Cold disasters often peak emotionally after temperatures rise, when attention shifts away while consequences are still unfolding. What stands out most, looking back, is how calm everything appeared. There were no mass evacuations, no emergency broadcasts dominating the airwaves, no dramatic images that demanded attention. The city never looked like it was in danger, and that appearance mattered. It shaped behavior, it delayed caution, it softened urgency. Winter didn't need to overpower Chicago, it only needed the city to trust itself. And that trust wasn't foolish, it was earned. Chicago had endured cold before. It had infrastructure, experience, and confidence. But deadly winters don't punish ignorance. They punish assumption. They take advantage of the belief that we've handled worse. And they slip through the small differences that people don't notice until later. Colder wind, longer exposure, thinner margins. By the time the story became clear, it was already over. The city moved on, as cities always do. But the lesson remained, quiet and uncomfortable. A winter doesn't have to look dramatic to be dangerous. It doesn't need to stop traffic or darken skylines. It can move alongside daily life, letting routine carry people forward while safety slowly drains away. This is why this winter matters. Not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. It showed how easily danger can hide inside normalcy, and how a city's greatest strength, its ability to keep going, can sometimes make it harder to see when something has gone wrong. And as the streets filled again, and the cold faded into memory, the city left behind a truth that still applies, everywhere. When winter blends into routine, that's when it deserves the most respect. To understand why this winter became deadly, you have to look beyond temperature and into structure, not just buildings, but lives. In Chicago, the cold did not strike everyone the same way. It followed invisible lines that already existed long before winter arrived. Housing quality mattered, energy access mattered, social connection mattered. Those who lived in well-insulated homes with reliable heating experienced discomfort. Those in older buildings, poorly maintained apartments, or temporary housing experienced risk. Cold magnifies inequality quietly. It does not create vulnerability. It exposes it. Many of the people most affected lived alone. Isolation was not dramatic. It was ordinary. Elderly residents whose routines had narrowed over time, workers who lived far from family, people who didn't expect a daily check-in. When cold slows the body, isolation removes the final safeguard. There is no one to notice delayed movement, no one to question silence, no one to step in when a decision not to move becomes dangerous. Winter doesn't require negligence, it only requires privacy. Energy, too, played a central role. Heating systems didn't always fail completely. They weakened. They worked unevenly. They gave just enough warmth to delay alarm. That partial failure is far more dangerous than total loss because it encourages waiting. People adapt, instead of escaping. They add layers. They stay still. They tell themselves conditions are tolerable. By the time warmth truly disappears, the body may no longer be able to recover quickly. Cold rewards delay with fatigue and punishes action with exhaustion. Another factor was expectation. Chicago is a city that knows winter. That experience breeds confidence. People believe they understand how cold behaves because they've lived with it for years. But this winter crossed a subtle threshold. Not the coldest ever, not the most dramatic, but persistent enough to erode margins. Familiarity became a liability. People measured danger against memory, not conditions. They compared the day to previous winters they survived, without noticing what was different. Longer exposure, stronger wind, weaker systems, thinner personal safety nets. Public response followed the same pattern. Emergency services worked, but they responded to calls. They didn't preemptively reach into homes. Cities are designed to react, not to sense gradual risk. Cold disasters don't overwhelm systems instantly. They stretch them slowly. By the time patterns become visible, the most vulnerable have already been affected. Winter doesn't demand attention all at once. It spreads its impact across hours, neighborhoods, and lives, making it difficult to grasp in real time. What ultimately made this winter deadly was not a single failure, but alignment. Cold, aligned with isolation, with aging infrastructure, with economic pressure, with routine. When multiple small weaknesses overlap, they create conditions where ordinary life becomes unsafe without anyone realizing it. That is the danger modern societies underestimate. Not collapse, but quiet convergence. This is why the lesson of this winter reaches far beyond one city or one year. Deadly cold does not need extraordinary circumstances. It only needs a system tuned for efficiency instead of resilience, and people trained to trust routine over instinct. Winter did not defeat Chicago by force. It waited until protection thinned naturally. And that is what makes this story so important, because nothing about these conditions has disappeared. When the temperatures finally rose and the city of Chicago returned to its familiar pace, it was easy to believe the danger had passed. Snow melted, streets cleared, life resumed its shape. The winter became a memory, filed away as another difficult season that had been endured. But the most important part of this story doesn't live in the coldest day or the final number of lives lost. It lives in what the winter quietly revealed about how people think, how cities function, and how easily danger can hide inside normal life. The lesson is not that cold is unpredictable. The lesson is that routine is powerful enough to override caution. People did not make bad choices that winter. They made ordinary ones. They trusted experience. They trusted systems. They trusted that a day that looked normal would behave normally. That trust is reasonable, and that is why it is dangerous. Deadly winters don't defeat people through panic or ignorance. They succeed when nothing feels urgent enough to interrupt daily life. This is why the most dangerous cold does not look extreme. It does not announce itself with storms or spectacle. It borrows the appearance of every winter before it and asks people to behave exactly as they always have. And when people do, winter gains time, the one resource it needs more than anything else. There is also a deeper, uncomfortable truth here. Modern life is built on continuous support, heat, transport, communication, proximity to others. When even one of those weakens, the system becomes fragile. When several weaken quietly at the same time, the risk multiplies. The cold doesn't need to shut everything down. It only needs to thin connections, fewer interactions, fewer checks, fewer chances to intervene. What happened in Chicago is not an exception. It is a pattern that repeats across places and decades. The details change, but the structure stays the same. People assume winter is manageable because it usually is. Cities assume systems will hold because they usually do. and most of the time, those assumptions are correct. Deadly winters exist in the space where usually fails. This story matters because it refuses to stay in the past. Nothing about it belongs to another era. The buildings still exist, the routines still exist, the confidence still exists, and so does the cold. Winter did not teach a lesson by destroying the city. It taught it by moving through the city unnoticed. Perhaps the most important realization is this: danger does not always arrive as disruption. Sometimes it arrives as continuity, as the quiet permission to keep going, as the absence of alarm. And when danger looks like normal life, it becomes much harder to recognize, especially for those already stretched thin. The people who didn't come home that winter were not careless. They were not unprepared in any obvious way. They were living inside a system that worked just well enough to hide its limits. That is not a failure of individuals. It is a reminder of how survival depends on margins and how quickly those margins can disappear. In the end, this is not a story about fear. It is a story about awareness. Winter does not need to be fought. It needs to be respected. Because the moment cold blends into routine, that is when it becomes most dangerous. And that is the lesson this winter left behind, quietly, in a city that kept moving.